What is a lighthouse? It is a tower with a bright light at the top, located at an important or dangerous place. The main purpose of a lighthouse is to serve as a navigational aid and to warn of dangerous areas. Welcome to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast. Illuminating the darkness of current EMS clinical practice with the bright light of science. Here are your hosts, Dr. Jeff Jarvis and Mike Verkest.
Howdy, y'all. This is Dr. Jeff Jarvis, and we have another episode of the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast. So this episode, I wanted to get out really quick because I was so excited about a paper I saw on the way home from Colorado. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube and watching the video, what you'll notice is I might look a little rough. That's because I just got off of the plane, got home after a long day of travel. So I was in Colorado. My family and I went on vacation, spent a wonderful week in Colorado Springs. Oh my God, it is beautiful there. I love Texas, but every time I'm in the mountains, I come home and I'm wondering, why do I not live in the mountains? Gorgeous place. So we got to relax. We got to unwind. I got to see my cousin, Christine, and she has been doing a lot of hiking. Well, she dragged me and pushed me along with her for a hike up Pikes Peak. So we did the bar trail, if you're familiar with that. It's around between 12 and 13 miles from base up to the top of Pikes Peak. So that is around 7,500 feet of vertical ascent. And at the top, you get up to 14,115 feet. Now, the reason that's important is because for a 12-mile walk, no big deal, right? Well, it's straight up the side of the frickin' mountain, and there ain't no oxygen up there. Now, I am a landlubber down here at sea level, and what I found is going up the side of that mountain kicked my butt. I have never moved so slowly in my life. I've never felt like I had COPD or perhaps COVID. I was actually hypoxic. My watch was showing my sat. Fortunately, it was only down to around 89 or so. So mostly this is just so I can complain and whine. Anyway, it was so cool. I just had to share that with you. So bottom line, please forgive the roughness of my face. Let's talk some research, shall we? What I want to talk about is a paper our friends from the Seattle Fire Department did about the association between failed intubation attempts and outcome in cardiac arrest. And as y'all know, I really have an interest in airway management, particularly in cardiac arrest, and I've been a bit befuddled by two of the large randomized controlled trials. So I really was looking forward to a trial like this because I think it can help us explain those results. All right, first off, let's talk about the citation. This was by Dr. Murphy and his colleagues, including Dr. Counts and Dr. Sayre, up at Seattle Medic 1. And the name of the paper is Fewer Tracheal Intubation Attempts are Associated with Improved Neurologically Intact Survival Following Out-of-Hospital Cardiac Arrest. It was published less than a week ago in Resuscitation. Now, I have to give the authors credit because they just told you the results. Everything you need to know, boom, right there in the title. It was amazing. Fewer tracheal intubation attempts are associated with improved neurologically intact survival from out-of-hospital cardiac arrest. All right, guys, that's the podcast. That's it for now. That's right. You are my fellow nerds, and you want to know the juicy nerd-like details. So let's talk about it, shall we? So I mentioned PART and Airways 2. Now, I've talked about both of these trials on the pod before, but let's go back really quick. PART was the U.S. study, multi-center study, randomizing patients to either get intubation or a King LT. It showed a 2.9% improved survival at 72 hours in those patients who had a King LT. And then Airways 2. So this was the UK version, and they randomized not patients, but paramedics to either have their initial airway attempt with intubation or with an i-gel. And overall, they found no difference in survival. Now, there was one caveat to that, and that is if you go in and look at just those patients who actually had an attempt, you would see that there is a 1.3% higher survival in the i-gel group. So you will have to pardon me because I've been away for a while. No one has been at the house, and the cats have been very lonely. This one in particular loves getting involved with podcasting. So say hello to my daughter's cat, Nova. Hello, Nova. So if you ever see a weird cat picture in my backdrop, that's Nova. Let's see how long it takes Nova to hop back up and get involved in the podcast again. So what I was saying is in Airways 2, if you only look at those patients who had an attempt, higher survival with the i-gel. Now, the other thing we know is that first pass success in both of these trials was really bad with intubation. Part where they actually reported first pass success showed 51% first pass success with intubation versus like 90% with King LT. Airways 2 didn't report first pass success. They reported success within 2 attempts. And basically, if you dig through some of the addendums and stuff online, you'll find that their first pass success was about the same. So the big question is how much of an impact did first pass success have on ultimate outcome? Now, we looked at this in part. We did a secondary analysis, and we basically fitted a model where we would look at first pass success with whatever airway device you had, intubation or King LT, and saw what impact that had on outcome. And we saw there that first pass success was associated with increased ROSC, but not increased survival. Now, even though I was a part of that study, see what I did there, part, I'm not entirely satisfied with the methods. I do think it's important, but we really don't know how important first pass intubation is. So that leads us to this study. The bottom line is we want to see what is the impact of increased intubation attempts on survival. All right, so what was the study? The methods, this was a retrospective registry study of all patients in the Medic One registry. So they have a CARES registry where they track their cardiac arrest survival. They also have something I'm very jealous of, an airway registry that they use REDCap for. So basically the medic after every intubation will go in and track a bunch of data points. So they get really good granular information from this. I'm very jealous about this. Now, what they did is they looked at outcome stratified by the number of intubation attempts. So they said, well, was outcome higher with success within 1 attempt versus 2 attempts versus 3 attempts? And they reported that number outright, 80% versus 60% or whatever the number may be. But they also did a logistic regression model where they said, what is the impact on our outcome of each additional intubation attempt after controlling for all of the other variables? So the confounders that we already know about, things like age and witness to rest, initial shockable rhythm, bystander CPR, all of the Epstein things. All right, so they're going to give us raw numbers and an adjusted odds ratio. The population they were looking at, these were all adult, non-traumatic, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest who had at least 1 intubation attempt. And since we're looking at intubation attempts, I think that's a pretty reasonable thing. The time period was January 1, 2015 to June 30th, 2019. So a 4-year period there. They excluded patients who had an EMS witnessed arrest. So they weren't dead when we get there. They arrest in front of us. They excluded the obvious DNR, DNIs. They excluded patients who were intubated by an outside agency. And then they would also exclude all patients who had the intubation after the first episode of ROSC. So if you get there and they're in cardiac arrest, but you shock them, they get pulses back, and then you intubate them, those patients were excluded also. Now, the intervention and control, just kind of sticking to our PICO question, well, there was no real intervention and control because this was not a randomized controlled trial. Again, what they were looking for is the impact of number of intubation attempts on overall outcome. So with that in mind, let's talk a little bit about intubation. All of their intubation attempts are with direct laryngoscopy. There is no video laryngoscopy in this system. They do have a bougie use or a bougie available for use. And as a matter of fact, they now have a protocol that says you need to use the bougie on all initial attempts. And this system has published a paper showing that that initial bougie use improved first pass success. So that's a good thing. For backup airways, they had an iGel and then a surgical crike if that didn't work. Now, each one of their airways, they looked at the chart and the paramedic reported whether each attempt was successful or not and how many attempts there were in each case. They report that in their chart, and they happen to use ESO, so they reported in ESO. And they also report it in that REDCap registry. So how did they define success and an attempt? Well, they used the universal definition of an attempt. That is when the laryngoscope passes the teeth, whether you attempt to pass an ET tube or not. And I say universal attempt or universal definition. There is actually a really good position paper. It's a fairly old position paper now from the National Association of EMS Physicians. Dr. Henry Wang was the lead author on that, and it defined the data elements for an airway registry, and one of those was an attempt, and that's how they used it, and that's how most good research defines an attempt. Now, in terms of confirmation, the medic said that the tube was successful based on the presence of four-phase waveform capnography. In other words, the appropriate way to do it. Now, they would also go in after the fact and look at CodeStat that's Physio-Control's reporting software that'll go in and look at all of the waveforms. So if the medic says first attempt was successful at this time, they can go in and look at the entitled CO2 and see there was no CO2 and then a good waveform right at the time they say they were successful, and that independently confirms what they said. Now, their life packs actually have the audio recording feature, and they turn that on so they get yet another independent confirmations. Bottom line, I think this is a good methodology. It's good for quality improvement, and I think it is a good way to do this research. And the bottom line is I think we can trust what they're saying here. All right. Their primary outcome was functional, neurologically intact survival at hospital discharge using a CPC score of 1 or 2. And again, that's pretty standard. They looked at secondary outcomes, including ROSC and survival to admission and survival to discharge. But it's really the one that we care about as their primary one. What was the impact on neurologically intact survival? Now, they started off with a little over 2,000 patients, and then they started excluding patients. So the most common exclusions were because of an EMS witnessed arrest, BLS only arrest. Now remember, Seattle is a tiered system, so they do have some arrest where the BLS unit is the only one involved in care, the obvious DNR, and then those patients who had ROSC before the intubation attempt. Bottom line, they had 1,201 patients involved in the ultimate analysis. Now, men were more likely than women to have multiple ET attempts, and that's probably just a function of body habitus and more difficult intubation. This is a no-brainer, but I think it's really important that we say this. Additional ET attempts were associated with a longer time to definitive airway and with a longer resuscitation. You may be thinking, well, duh, it took them longer to intubate, so of course it's going to, take longer. But when we talk about the limitations, we're going to come back and hit on this. Now, their overall first pass success was 63%. Success within 2 attempts was 86%. Ultimately, 97% of patients were intubated successfully with up to 4 attempts. 3% ultimately ended up with a supraglottic airway and less than 1% with a crike. What's the bottom line? Now, overall, regardless of the number of attempts, their overall survival, functionally intact survival, was 8.1%. And it's important to remember this is all comers. So asystole to, VFib, all patients. Now, the success or the survival by attempt. Here we go. Overall is 8.1, regardless of the number of attempts. First pass success, survival, 10.8%. So if first pass success is higher than your overall survival, what that means is that not first pass success is going to be lower, and indeed that's what we see. Neurologically intact survival with 2 attempts is 4.3, 3 attempts, 2.6, and 4 attempts, 2%. So we see a drop from first pass success of 10.8 all the way down to 2% survival with 4. And the biggest drop was between 1 attempt and 2 attempts. 10.8 drops down all the way to 4.3, and then the curve slows a little bit. So what that tells me is that first pass success is really, really important. Now, I mentioned they did an adjusted odds ratio after controlling for all of the normal Utstein variables, and what they found is an adjusted odds ratio of 0.41 per additional attempt. Now, to put that in context, that means that each additional attempt is associated with a 59% decreased odds of survival with each attempt. Again, that tells me first pass success, really, really important. So, by the way, I mentioned there were other outcomes, ROSC and other type, they were all the same. Numbers a little bit different, but the trends were the same. Now, they also stratified this based on the initial rhythm, shockable versus non-shockable. No difference. It didn't change the ultimate conclusion, and that is additional attempts are associated with decreased survival. All right, let's talk limitations. So first off, all the normal limitations. It's a retrospective chart review, the paramedic self-reported success. I'm not all that worried about the paramedics reporting success because of their validation steps. I think those are appropriate. I think if they said it took them 1 attempt, it took them 1 attempt. The retrospective aspect of it, it's true, that's a limitation, and therefore the results can only be exploratory or hypothesis generating and not show causality. But we ain't going to get a randomized controlled trial on this. It is not ethical to intentionally miss an intubation. So we're never going to see that. I think the biggest limitation is resuscitation bias, and I don't know a way, honestly, to avoid this. But let's talk about what resuscitation bias is. One thing that we know very clearly about cardiac arrest is the longer you're in arrest, the lower your chances of survival. And any study that is looking at a variable that is related to resuscitation time, the results that we see, we want to say are because of that variable, but it could be because of the amount of time they're in arrest. So, for example, maybe the reason people with 4 attempts had lower survival than those with 1 is they were in arrest for a longer period of time. So resuscitation bias, it's real. It's a big deal in cardiac arrest research. And again, I have no idea how to control for it in this study. Let's wrap it up. What is my takeaway? I think this is a well-done study on a really, really important topic. I don't think we're ever going to get better data from this. We can just get more data from studies done just as well that show the same thing. And when we do that, we'll get closer and closer to the truth. So I'm very glad they did this study. Their conclusion that additional intubation attempts are bad, that is almost certainly true. We're kind of at the point now where I don't know how you can argue that. I don't think anybody would really argue that additional attempts are good. You might have someone argue that they don't make a difference, but I think the evidence is pretty clear. I think this paper is accurate. First pass success matters. And if first pass success matters, that can probably go a long way to explaining the results from Airways 2 and PART. So I saw this paper, I got excited about it, and I put it up on social media, and I got a response from Dr. Jared Troutman. He is a fellow Texas medical director. And he said, "That's great, Jeff. Great paper. What the hell am I supposed to do with this information?" Well, here is my takeaway with what to do with it. I think first you have to take an honest look at how well your system performs EMS. Not you, because obviously you listen to my podcast, you're going to be above average. You're going to be great at intubation. But what do you do with the system? And take an honest look at how your system intubates. And if you're not very good at it, if you have a first pass success around 50 to say 60, 70%, supraglottics are probably the way to go. We know that there is no worse outcome with supraglottics, so I think at worst, they're just as good as intubation. And getting good at intubation takes a lot of time and energy and money from the system. It's just hard. Not every system can do it. However, if you are doing intubation, I think that you have to limit the number of attempts. So this is what I am highly likely to do in my system. Right now, we allow 2 attempts at intubation before going to a supraglottic. I'm probably going to drop that down to 1 attempt. It is either a first pass success or an IGEL. And I think that is because we have good evidence here that survival drops with each additional attempt. So that's the bottom line on this paper. I think it was a really good paper. I'm really glad to see it. I always like papers that reinforce my preconceived notion just to announce my bias, but I think their methods really support this conclusion. So I'm excited about it. I'm interested to hear what y'all have to say. Drop me an email. I am Jeff Jarvis at flightbridgeed.com. You can get me on Twitter at Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Please let me know what you think about this. Thanks, guys. Y'all take care.
You've been listening to the EMS Lighthouse Project podcast, a proud member of the Flightbridge Ed podcast family and a Fire Dog production. Visit flightbridgeed.com for more information.